Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Trish, and thank you, Joe. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really pleased to be here talking about this. I was just saying to Joe before that it's been a couple of years since I worked on this project, and it's been really good to have an opportunity to get back into the data again before coming today and really refresh my memory as to how great this was to work on, how much I enjoyed working on this particular project as well. So yeah, here today to share some lessons, some ideas, some recommendations on peer mentoring. And the first thing I've done there is just put the slides into the chat for you. So if anybody wants to follow along as we go, you've got access to those right there. I will say as well, everything that I've made really is kind of Creative Commons. You know, I like to share things out. So if you're the kind of person who likes to screenshot things and share them and tweet them and whatever, that's absolutely fine. And you can have these slides and you can share them with anybody. It might help in terms of designing a peer mentoring program for PGRs. And I'll tell you what I've been working on. So I was working with my colleague, Chris Blackmore, who is a senior university teacher in mental health at the University of Sheffield. So at the time, I was also at the University of Sheffield. I'm at the University of Glasgow now. And we applied for a little bit of funding together to look at what happens when you put new PGRs and more experienced PGRs together. You know, what kinds of things go on within that conversation, what kinds of things are helpful that come out of that, and what kinds of things are actually unhelpful that come out of that. And I'll tell you why we did this as we go through today. And what we were really looking for is the boundaries of peer mentoring. What can we say it works for, and what can't we say it works for? As you will well know, because you're all here today as part of this network which focuses on mental health and researcher well-being, it's a priority now for everybody. Everybody wants to talk about this. Everybody wants to do something that supports researchers. Everybody wants to think about how mental health is poor in these groups and what we might do to prevent that, or certainly not to contribute to it. And very commonly sort of preventing isolation, adding people into cohorts, bringing them into communities, developing thriving cultures and enabling conversations are things that are on the top of the list for being able to facilitate things that actively support well-being, good mental health. We know that our departments, be they departments, schools, grad schools, whatever the structures are around us, there's really goodwill to want to respond in support of our PGRs. And often, and because I work in mentoring and I've worked in mentoring a long time, people will come to me and say, we need to have a peer mentoring program because we want to achieve this. Can you do some training? And that's normally where a conversation starts. And I'll say, who are the mentors? What are they going to be doing? What aren't they going to be doing? So we start this process of investigation, because while it's a popular choice, it's not well theorized and it's not very well evidenced in terms of its applications or its effectiveness. We can imagine something good takes place, but actually what's the nature of that? And what are some of the downsides? What can happen within these kinds of programs that we would want to think about and head off at the design phase? It's very common for those programs to be focused at the transition stage. So people coming into PhD programs are assigned to usually somebody within their school or certainly faculty or college who's a little bit more experienced, who's been here a while, who knows where things are, who knows who people are. And that's because as we transition into something, the learning curve, the difference, let's say, between what we are, who we are, and what we know, and what we need to know in order to succeed with a doctorate is really high. It's really complex. It can be quite demanding, and obviously there's an emotional aspect, an emotional side to that. And that we know that lots of the old ways of thinking, the old-fashioned, old-school ways of thinking, if we recruit the right people, you'll see these words go, if we just recruit better people, if we recruit the best and the brightest, blah, 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 we'll be able to head this off and everybody will get on and succeed and thrive. And actually, that's not what happens at all. It's not an objective academic progression into the PhD. It's not about intellectual capability. It's about the ability to emotionally process and make sense of things that are going on, things that are different, and really a whole paradigm shift for the researchers who are experiencing their PhD. And what we see, probably you've seen the same thing, as all sort of learning, study management, self-governance strategies fall away. The things that used to work either within a learning environment or an employment environment. You know, the strategies that we used to have that worked for us don't work anymore in the doctorate. They sort of fall away, and that really impacts on our levels of confidence, self-belief, how motivated we feel. And the initial enthusiasm and excitement can really quickly be eroded when we realize how big and complex the task is, with so many uncertainties and insecurities. And this is a really key point, really. There's a high number of people being stressed out in these first few weeks, these first few months even, as they're disoriented, and their feelings of getting very overwhelmed by all the new things that there are to learn. And this idea of, you know, the different things we talk about in PhDs that we never really explain to people. You've got to be an independent researcher, you know, you've got to make an original contribution. All of these things that people don't know how to be, how to do, how to even interpret what's required and expected of them. And I've just linked something there that I thought might be of interest. It's kind of a tangential to this talk, so I've popped it there. And it's a blog that I co-edit called the Hidden Curriculum blog. It looks at all the sort of hidden and informal learning that goes on within PhDs. And we had a call last year for posts related to the concept of independence and becoming independent, and what that means and how that happens. And actually, we're just turning that into a new book. But yeah, there's 12 posts on there, all looking at different facets of independence and what that means. Because it's something, like I said, we bandy the word around. We say you're going to become something through this process, but we're not going to tell you what it is. So no wonder everybody feels a bit uncertain and insecure when they come into the PhD. And our framing, Chris and I's framing, what we were thinking of when we thought about the experiences that new PGRs were having on their way into the PhD, was the idea of the disorientating dilemma. So the first initiating factor in transformative learning theory. You know, which says that in order to really shift our paradigm or shift our perspective and be transformed and have this transformative learning experience, we actually have to go through a stage of confusion first. That's the thing that initiates the transformation. And that over several stages, we can resolve this disorientation, we can resolve this sense of confusion if we have appropriate structures around us that support the parallel processes of critical reflection. You know, what's happening to me? Does this make sense? How will I go forward? What have I learned? How do I put this into practice? And rational discourse. So exploring with others all of these newly discovered misfits between how you thought this would go, what you expected, what's actually on offer, and the old premises of how to operate in a workplace and how to get learning done, and the requirements of the new environment. So two things there: critical reflection and rational discourse. And if you're anything you're like me, you'll try and relate everything back to mentoring. And I think those are two things that relate very nicely back to mentoring. You know, the idea of prompting self-awareness, prompting that reflection, and through a conversation, through dialogue, being able to make sense of that. So here we go. Who are the agents then of this idea of rational discourse? Of course, we've got things that are well established that we already know, like supervisors. We've got our PGR administrators, PGR tutors and conveners, grad school managers, all of the different kinds of researcher development and researcher support staff across the university. And those good professional relationships can support really good dialogue for finding out actually what's going on here. What do I need to be able to do? How am I going to make my way through this? And there's lots in the research about this wider set of meaningful others, not just the people we think of first, the supervisors, but really implicating peer networks in being able to provide really good social, academic, and psychological support for PGRs. And through these emotional and social support systems, we see that both motivation and momentum for engaging with the doctorate and making progress through the doctorate can be supported. These peer support models also provide really good support for those that engage with them and those that are engaged with them. Peer support and things like mentoring, peer mentoring models and peer communities are actually very, very valuable. And so at first glance, no wonder they appear to be the simple solutions to these problems of sort of stress and transition and isolation. Because whilst we're always very limited on supervisors and support staff, there's lots and lots of PGRs around in universities, and it seems to be a really simple way to solve things by popping people together and saying, yeah, you're doing mentoring now, let's take a look at this. So you can see why it's a popular choice. So I think, given it is so popular and everybody seems to want to do it, expanding that evidence base should be a priority for us. And I guess I'm urging some caution in peer mentoring design. And this is based on different requests I've had through the places I've worked and also the places I've done consultancy for. So lots and lots of places. The expectations of what peer mentoring can achieve tend to be really high. It tends to be a bit of a, if we have peer mentoring, it can be a panacea and everybody will be happy and everybody will be, fully engaged member of the community. And sometimes the expectations and the language of what people are looking to achieve through peer mentoring can really stray into the inappropriate. I would say things like where people are saying, we really want the peer mentors to support each other with their annual review or training needs analysis or their confirmation review or upgrade report writing. We want them to give each other feedback on their writing, and we want them to do all the pastoral care side of things so that supervisors can just focus on the academic side of things. And these are things that I have, I guess, heard, try to reframe, and sometimes said, no, I don't want to work on that, because I think there is a tendency to over-expect from other PGRs. If we think who these mentors are, we really need to understand what the boundaries of that are and what the role, the critical, essential, central role of that peer mentor is, so that we don't take the stress that all of our new PGRs are experiencing and just transfer it across to their mentors who are already busy, they have their own projects to do, and are often doing work they've not been paid for. So in order to have a closer look at this is what Chris and I did. We set up a short, very short, just 5 months peer mentoring program. And we put this in place for people who were 3 months into their PhD. So if they'd sort of joined in the September-ish, then around Christmas time, we invited them to join this peer mentoring program, thinking by then they'd have a lot of questions about how things work. And their mentors were third-year PGRs, all in the same faculty or in the same broad organisation, but outside of department. So we wanted to introduce people to somebody just a little bit outside their own discipline area and outside their own department, but still within the broad research paradigm that the researchers were working with. And we invited them along to an induction workshop. We matched them cross department and we started the program. And then we asked them to, in the first meeting, do mentoring agreements, very typical thing to do if you work in mentoring programs, to sit down and decide what they wanted to work on and how that would work, what they could each offer to each other, and what the priorities were really for just this very short period. After that, we asked them to fill in a form about what they'd experienced, what they talked about, and how helpful it was. And then we asked them to meet again in 3 months and then 5 months. And after their meeting, again, to record their thoughts on a form. At 6 months, we interviewed some of them and combined those meeting notes with the interview data to take a look at what had gone on within these peer mentoring partnerships. And this is based on the idea of sort of near peer, so slightly down the chain, and then offering this idea of rational discourse, which would include things like reflection on what's gone on, self-evaluation, is that working for you? What might be better? What might you do instead? What approach have you tried? What might you take? What are your options? What's not working for you and what strategies might you put in place? And that covered both project and personal, sort of more holistic mentoring, as people navigated and balanced their home and life and working challenges and the context and all the different personal and interpersonal relationships around them. And we always ask them to keep that focused on how that relates to PhD progress. So whilst they were absolutely free to explore topics, what we wanted to know was of what value were these conversations to making progress with the PhD. And then, as I said before, the two pieces of data we collected were online forms and that end of program interviews. And I put some information here about what we collected. So the electronic form was used after each of the 3 meetings by mentees and mentors separately. And that documented both the content of those conversations and the utility, how useful it had been. And it asked how well the mentor was able to help on 3 categories. So with information sharing, with wellbeing support, and then with enabling the mentee to take action towards making progress in the doctorate. It also had a very specific box saying, what couldn't your mentor help with? What couldn't be resolved? What are your outstanding learning requirements now? And then the interviews, again, these were more in depth, and we didn't frame them in such a certain way. We let people sort of self-define how they'd understood concepts such as support or well-being or making progress in the PhD, because we really wanted to know sort of from their perspective how they'd approached and benefited from working and the conversations that they had with their mentor. We brought the field notes into the interview to use it as interview prompts. And then we compared and cross-linked across the cases, across the 2 types of data, looking for themes of support, well-being, progress, and boundaries. And this is where we got to with this. So thinking of this research question, what are the reasonable boundaries of peer mentoring for new postgraduate researchers? This is what we found. Firstly, we found that the boundaries we had set, so we input certain boundaries, Chris and I, at the induction session, we told people that there were certain parameters and boundaries to this program, and we found that they had been understood and they had been applied. And the boundaries that we set within those were the time frame. We said it's going to be a program, it's going to last for this long, it's going to start at this time, it's going to end at this time. So that was a boundary we had set. But the reason I mention it here is sometimes these kinds of boundaries, when we think of peer mentoring, aren't set. It's just you and you're a pair now, please go about it and meet. So yeah, I just wanted to offer you some ideas for boundaries you might input into your programs. We told them how many hours of mentoring delivery to expect. And we said it was the initial meeting where they got to meet each other at the induction, and then 3 hours, that's all, 3 hours over that period of time. If they chose to add more, they could do that, but I thought it was really good to set the expectations so that the mentor wasn't answering a question every 3rd day, wasn't meeting their mentee for hours at a time and straying into something more demanding for them, certainly as a time demand. And it also really helped mentees to focus their time and energy, what they wanted to get from the mentor. If they only got an hour every few weeks, they're going to make it worth it. They're going to do the preparation for the mentoring. A boundary we input was we told them everything was absolutely confidential, as you would expect from a mentoring program, but it's really good to set that boundary explicitly because it's really stressful to have other people go and mention things about you to different colleagues in different places. So asking people to be very mindful of this, I think, helped to frame the kinds of things and to build trust between that partnership and to help them get to some of the more complex ideas. And then we set boundary that the kinds of specialist support that is provided by a specialist service wouldn't be provided by the mentor. So they weren't going to do English language support or proofreading. They weren't going to do support for the content of the thesis. They weren't going to be reading literature reviews. They weren't going to be doing very specific mental health interventions, and they weren't going to be doing things like visa advice. So, things that we have teams for within universities and really requires a specialist knowledge and skill set. But what we did do is put all of the information about these places into the hands of the mentors and the mentees and say, this is where you go for other sources of support. So we established that through the induction session. And then also, as I said before, we gave them a mentoring agreement, a contracting process between the pairs where they could sit down and decide what was on the table, what was off, what were the topics that they wanted to focus on as priorities, and what would they like to have achieved within this. So really focusing it down into something of value to the mentees. And this is what we found when we interviewed people and looked across the different types of data we collected. We found that everyone said they valued the opportunity and recommended such a program should continue. And that's mentors and mentees alike. everyone said that they'd, received support. Mentors as well had been supported by their mentees, and everybody also thought that the opportunity to learn mentoring skills, but in particular to learn boundary setting, was a really good PhD or research skill that would serve them through the course of their PhD. We found from looking in our categories of the kinds of conversations and the topics of conversations that mentoring was used for information sharing, absolutely. For things like study skills, people talked about partitioning time, writing short bursts, Pomodoro technique. They signposted each other to different parts of our doctoral development programs, different courses and different workshops that they might want to go to or not. And they also talked a lot about self-governance, how to operate in the research workplace, how to respond to people, how to challenge things that you thought might not be appropriate. And then also matters of things like career strategy, like trying not to do it all at once. What's for now, what's for later, what's my career priority, where do I want to go after the PhD? And that we found lots and lots of that related back to wellbeing support. So it wasn't that pairs were doing wellbeing support specifically, but having the opportunity to talk about all the things related to study skills, how to operate in the workplace, and career strategy supported well-being as well. Just having those conversations was relief. It relieved stress and it offered support to the mentees. Further aids to well-being were people said, they really had a sense of connectedness to somebody and that they trusted the person and they were glad the person had volunteered to be a mentor and that they felt they were all on the same page because they'd all been together at the induction session. People found their sense of good well-being was increased by just being listened to, having the chance to sit down and talk to somebody about things that they'd not identified another player to talk to about, things that they wouldn't necessarily talk to their supervisor about, or they wouldn't necessarily go to somebody who they felt to be official in their department. Making sense of the research environment, as I said before, and then just relating to others' experience, realizing that, this idea of the disorientating dilemma is happening to everybody, being able to relate to that and understand how other people move forward from that moment and how they really reframed and shifted their perspective on what the PhD was and how to make your way through it. Mentors absolutely benefited. Reported gaining the educational skill set that is mentoring, a set of educational practices that they could use in different situations. And also they gained information from their mentees. But they also said they got their opportunity through sort of guiding, advising and listening to do their own reflection and sense making as well. So I would say from this aspect, definitely objectives achieved. And I've just included a couple of examples from the interview here, which I will read out to you. These are both from mentees. And the first one said, I sometimes feel they gave me more work than I should have done, but I didn't know really how to deal with that because I just took all the work and then got stressed. So then I talked to mentor about those kind of problems and she helping me the way I should think about it. I need to first talk to that person. And if I cannot, I have to go to a higher person to talk about my problems because I get too overwhelmed with all the work. I took most of those kind of problems to my mentor and she shared her own experience, just kind of telling me I can think about some options. And she just kind of helped me through, sometimes just listen to my problems. I find it's very helpful for me, at least say something to someone and then I realize on my own and the problem actually is. So there's so much, you can really see so much kind of a very distinct strategy about being overloaded with work and how to address that, the sort of the workplace strategies we need to be able to address that workload issue. Who do we go to first? Who do we go to after? And the real relating to each other in the middle. And at the end bit there, just the opportunity to speak out loud. I realize on my own, this sense of the rational discourse and the reflective thinking and the problems eased. And the second one, I think that I feel more confident when you see someone that's gone through all that process and didn't know that he'll make it at some point. So you don't feel overwhelmed oh my God, am I going to be able to make it? I felt really interested happy, optimistic afterwards, and like the motivation of getting some new information and just try to put it into practice. I just feel like during the PhD, you can feel confident and happy, but at some point you will feel like you're lost and, oh my God, what am I doing? Or like, yeah, too much information. And yeah, I mean, if they like share some cheerful tips, it's just like, yeah, you might feel okay. And that helps. So there again, you know, just the chance to speak to somebody and the idea of, yeah, they might get some tips, but what the more important thing is the chance to speak out loud, speak with somebody, relate to somebody, and seeing somebody who has succeeded and knowing that at some point they also felt like you as well, that sort of validation, relating to each other and realizing that they're not alone through that. So I just thought these were really interesting to have a look. And this second person really there saying, you know, they felt happy and optimistic and more interested in their PhD afterwards. So yeah, I would say peer mentoring most certainly adds value. But on the other side of that, it also very much has some limitations. So people, when I asked them in the interviews, you know, the boundaries that we set for you, how did that go? And everybody thought it seemed reasonable in practice. And people who'd said, actually, I wasn't sure why you were telling us we could do this and couldn't do this, and it was only this and not this at the beginning, actually, once we got into it, I found why you'd been telling us those things, because you know, there were certain things I couldn't help with. And people explicitly mentioned they were glad that there was a framing and some boundaries for the program. Really interestingly, both sides of a mentoring pair were in agreement about when boundary crossing occurred. So both the input boundaries and the boundaries they discovered that they couldn't help with, they were both very aware when that happened. And some of that will be in how they set the conversation up and how they made that agreement, and kind of the self-aware relationship that mentoring partnerships are, when you sit down and openly decide what you want to focus on and what you don't. But both sides, yeah, were really aware when a boundary was crossed and a mentor had to say, actually, I don't think I can help you with that. Let's get you to the right place. And for lots of things, the mentor could signpost the mentee to the right place. A big sticking point, though, for this was supervision relationships. I can't see you, but I can imagine everybody's nodding because we've seen this and we've seen this and we've seen this over and over again. So what I would say is peer mentoring can support and complement supervision relationships, as we saw with the person who was overloaded with work. They just needed a strategy to be able to go and talk to the appropriate person. So it will help mentees to understand what's happening to them, to normalize that, to understand their own styles and preferences, and to negotiate those styles and preferences and the boundaries that go along with them with their supervisors. But there were certain issues of supervision that peer mentoring absolutely can't do a single thing about. So if the supervisor is absent, if their feedback is absent or is overcritical, or if that person was in a sort of bullying or harassment situation, then peer mentoring is going to do absolutely nothing to support that. I mean, it might validate the experiences of the mentee. It might be able to make them more likely to speak up and go somewhere else to complain about it. But in terms of actually making a change in that moment, all of the mentees and mentors said those are things it couldn't help with. And there was a trade-off, and this came across quite strongly. And so it's another thing to think about with mentoring design, between transitioning into a disciplinary area and being enculturated, so having a mentor within your department that had a certain value, and having a mentor outside your department which offered a sort of more judgment-free, cleaner, more professionally distanced coaching space out of the department. You know, there's advantages and disadvantages to both, so I can't really answer to that, but it is something to think about, actually. And I would say I always come down on the side of giving people a mentor outside of their department, because they've already got access to people in their department. You know, if we're gonna make a match, let's introduce people to people they wouldn't otherwise normally meet. But yeah, that will be something for you to figure out, I think, with your programs and with your program designs. But there is a trade-off there, and it was acknowledged within the data. So really the preliminary recommendations coming out of this, I would say, are if you're going to run a PGR peer mentoring program, think really carefully about who your mentees and mentors are and the timings at which you recruit them and how you match them up with each other, who gets to speak to who. It's really essential to input some boundaries for the program rather than, an email on your first day, this is your mentor, off you go. A start point and an end point and a framing, a scaffolding for that program is really helpful to helping people understand what they're supposed to do. If they understand what they're supposed to do, they're more likely to actually do that thing. So peer mentoring offers a mechanism for professional learning, certainly, but also for wellbeing support. I think that came through strongly. And actually the two are intertwined. It's not one and the other, but it's the achieving of good wellbeing through making sense of professional learning. Peer mentoring definitely can't solve the issues of the poorest supervision experiences. And as we know, supervision is still the biggest predictor of wellbeing, happiness, completion for doctoral researchers overall. So whilst it might complement, it doesn't tackle that big area there. And I would recommend that we don't rely on peer support alone to fix issues of doctoral wellbeing, that we do think about what goes on in the framing of programs and the framing of other relationships and supporting players around the PGR. One thing we did, because nobody signed up for our wellbeing mentoring program, was change the name of it. And there we go, lesson learned, just being really careful to avoid any cultural discomfort or, let's say, gendered discomfort with the idea of going along to some sort of wellbeing intervention. But actually, thinking about the messaging that goes with such mentoring programs. And for me, the dream scenario is that, given this is specialist learning and teaching work, and this is an educational skill set we are asking PGRs to learn and perform for us, we should pay peer mentors as graduate teaching assistants. It's learning and teaching work, and whilst they get something fulfilling out of it as well, absolutely, I think peer mentors should be compensated properly for the work that they do on our behalf. And that might help people to think about how many hours they wanted to contract for that mentee or what was reasonable within that framework as well. So just really to conclude and say thanks that Chris and I's original work was sponsored at the University of Sheffield by the Senate Award Fellows Fund.